I'm almost 60 years old, so I lived through the period of where I lost a lot of my gay male friends to AIDS, in the early and mid 80s. And I also was present when they were disowned by their family members as they were dying. I think that history, that memory has survived. Never again is a LGBT kid going to be kicked out on the street. I think initially for some it came from a good place, a place of compassion. For some, I just think they're just very radical and they're more postmodernists and they want to destroy and deconstruct and destabilize. I think eventually we're going to learn that was not a good. This was not good.
Welcome to the Black Sheep. I'm Jay Klein, here with my co-founder, partner, and newly fiancée, Salome Siboney. And we are both here together with our friend, Zander Keig. So happy to be here with you, Zander. Zander is an award-winning social worker, speaker, and educator who provides emotional well-being webinars and hosts the popular Umbrella Hour podcast. Most recently, he released his book, The Third Space, A Non-Conformist Guide to the Universe, which he, very lovely of him, let us publish an excerpt of at the Black Sheep. So go and read that if you haven't yet. And thanks for being here, Zander.
Well, it's a joy for me to be here. I love both of you. So thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so glad to have you. I am particularly excited to have this conversation because I really enjoyed your book. And like I told you, it came to me at a time when I felt like I really needed it. And your book is about something that I think is only going to become more evident as a need and a constructive direction that we can take in dealing with many different problems and culture issues and personal problems also that come to us through life, which is often the sense of either or, black and white, us versus them, binary, rigid thinking. And your book, the title, The Third Space, exactly sums up the fact that it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm particularly excited to have this conversation because I think it's something that more people should be talking about, is how can we break out of these rigid ways of thinking. And so in your book, you discuss that concept and how it has come to you through your life, basically through always finding yourself in places where it was either the most efficacious choice to look for that third space, or you simply found yourself in that third space. So I'd love for you to tell us briefly, what does the third space mean to you?
Well, I think a lot of people are familiar with the concept that comes from Buddhism of the middle path, right? That you're taking this, you're walking your life's journey, not going off one side or the other, right? So that's kind of a familiar concept for people. The third space is similar to that, if not just a different way of saying the same thing, which is, for people who are unfamiliar, with the Buddha, he was raised in opulence, right? In a Hindu, very high class Hindu family. And then he was exposed to the reality of the world. And then he went off into the opposite direction and lived, among the Jains who were begging for food and living outdoors. And he realized, oh, okay, there's got to be a middle path between these two extremes. Right. And so that's the basic idea. And I've known about that for most of my life because my father introduced me to Buddhism and Taoism when I was 8 or 9 years old. Well, maybe more like 9 or 10 years old. And so it's like a concept that I grew up around with my family, or my father in particular, and my mother a little bit also. So whenever I went out into the world, I just intuited that, whatever people were saying, that there was possibly other realities going on, other opinions, other experiences. And then, as I got older, then I started to navigate some of those things myself. It started, with me, it started around gender stuff. That's where it started for me. And that was because I'm a trans man. So I'm female. So I was a girl when I was younger, and I was a tomboy. And that's where I first started noticing it was, um, what was expected of me was more in akin with my female cousins, right? Not my male cousins. I come from a very large Mexican Roman Catholic family, so I have a lot of cousins. And I didn't want to be like either my male or female cousins. I didn't have that desire. I just wanted to be me. I wanted to play sports, and I wanted to run around, and I wanted to wear, the clothes that I wanted to wear. But I was getting the feedback from my grandmother, my mother, that I was doing something wrong. I was getting that feedback from society that I was doing something wrong, like my peers in school, things like that. But as a person who has a very strong internal locus of control, I wasn't too bothered by that in the beginning, right? Eventually, it started to wear on me. But that wasn't until I was in my 30s. But this idea of, well, I don't want to dress like that or like that. I don't want to behave like that or behave like that. I'm just going to be me. And so just being me is occupying a third space. It came up again with religion a little later on when I was no longer going to Catholic services, and my father took me off to the Unitarians, which is very much can be like a third space for a lot of people when they leave their religions that they were raised in and go off into something else. So it just sort of evolved from there. But as a young age, those were the two primary places that I noticed that it showed up a lot. And there's so much um, pressure to conform
Yeah.
to religious, cultural, and gender
Ugh.
expectations. There really is. That's where this
Yeah.
nonconformity part comes in as well. I just didn't,
Right.
and it wasn't as if I was doing it to be rebellious. It
Right.
was just coming from me naturally.
Exactly. Yeah, that really comes across in your book, and there's so much I want to ask you about that. Do you want to take a question, or should I?
Yeah. So we published an article by one of our favorite guest writers at the Black Sheep, Gillian Florence Sanger, a little
Yeah.
bit ago, that also talked about this Buddhist middle path, and I think it's an excellent article. Something we talked about in the editing process for that we went back and forth about was what is the relationship between the middle path as it's understood by you, by Buddhism, and sort of centrism? Because when I think of, okay, well, this is in the middle, what I often think of is it's, somebody that doesn't want to take like a bold stand on either side, somebody that wants to try to seem like agreeable and is logically inconsistent. That's sort of what I think of when I think of political centrism. Maybe my stereotypes of that are wrong, but it's somebody that has like an inconsistent political philosophy and so just wants to be in the middle. So as
Mm,
applied to life, my question for you is like, what's the difference between the third space, how you conceive of it, and living kind of a how is that compatible with living a philosophically thought through life? Like what is it
mm.
exactly that's wrong with extremes per se?
Well, I've never really been a person who ascribes to extremes. So for me, it's just natural not to fall into and therefore align with more extreme ideas. Now, that's not to say I haven't been accused of being extreme. Um, I get referred to as far right, which I just find laughable. And that's just because I say things, that are unpopular. But I don't think that that makes me far right. This idea of centrism, well, inconsistency is a really interesting issue. I may be wrong, but I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who referred to consistency as the hobgoblin of little minds or something akin to that. Like, not, as an American Stoic, I think he was highly critical of this concept of being consistent. And it played out for him in his life. And so I would imagine that for people who ascribe to and are very attentive to consistency, I'm probably stepping all over that for them. Another way I think about centrism is it could be a blend. There are people who they take a center position because they're like, well, I'm a little bit liberal and I'm a little bit conservative, and so instead of calling themselves a moderate, they use centrist, and maybe they're using them synonymously sometimes. Um, and the only way we would know is if we actually ask them questions to get underneath that. Um, so this idea of centrism being either a blend of liberal and conservative, or centrist being completely outside but not using a different kind of word for it, like independent, right? I think sometimes people use independent, centrist, moderate interchangeably, and I don't think they are. But it's possible that people are saying one word, but they really mean something else. So it requires a conversation. But I'm I try to be somewhat consistent, but it's very difficult to be fully consistent with beliefs and values, and then how they get played out, how they're worked out in real life. I can be fairly consistent in my thoughts, but then when I'm out in the world, I notice that I can run up against some of those things. And I think that's probably just a normal thing that people run into. I value something, but I'm behaving in a way that's inconsistent. Um, and, why is that? So I think that's where introspection can come in, and people can ask themselves, well, why am I? Why am I behaving inconsistently with my values? Maybe it's that I don't actually value that thing. I just thought I did, or I thought I was supposed to, or I did, but now I don't, right? And that's a conversation with the self, and maybe, with the people closest to us.
Yeah, I like your statement about often being considered an extremist yourself, because I think that's something that when we were discussing that article about the Buddhist middle path, the idea of extremism came up because it's not so much always that you're either in the political sphere far left or far right, but you often find that it's the people who refuse to buy into that binary that get called extremist, or at least get tried to be painted as though there's some kind of antisocial, uncooperative radicals. And so each side will try to dump them on the opposing side as you're an extremist of that side because you're not helping this side. And so I think that's something that I also find fascinating about the concept that you write about in your book, the third path, or I'm sorry, I'm mixing up. Is it the third? It's
The third space.
The third space. I got the middle path. I
That's
got a
right.
friend's book called The Third Perspective, and I've got you the third the third space. There
Yes.
is this is why I say this is like really a concept for the moment. I think that there are so many different things that are kind of coming together to recognize this concept. And
I think what's going on, and why we're seeing this discussed by a number of people now, is that there's a tiredness with polarization. So, I think that your book handles this really well. And I think that Gillian's article, which we also talked about, answers this really well. But, to sort of answer that question I posed for you before, the difference between this concept and centrism is it's not a per se a reaction to a philosophical extreme. What it's a reaction to is this kind of emotional extreme of a polarization, where you're just trying to go fully to the opposite end of where somebody else is, and you guys kind of spiral away from each other, and you both wrap up at the ends of these poles a bunch of bad ideas in these poles. And if you can kind of get away from that groupthink, get away from that tribalism, then you can work back towards something that is more philosophically consistent. That isn't just like, an empty, like, mealy-mouthed centrism, but is something that's stronger than what's going on at these kind of like tribalized poles. So I think the space that you're talking about is really necessary to get more people into, so that they can start undergoing that process. So
Mm.
I think an important question, an important purpose of your book and your life's work as a social worker is how, especially in those times where we are seeing this going on so many places, and there's people like the three of us and the other authors that Salome mentioned that are kind of reacting back against this, but it's a very limited group of us. How do we get more people to think like us and be more thoughtful and not just have to go into the tribes? How according to your work and your experience can we do that?
Well, I think that sometimes people might mistake wanting to find, an alternative way to coexist in the world, or a different way to have conversations that are, sensitive, as a way of giving up on principles or convictions. And it's like, no, we still can hold those things. And I'm involved with an organization called Braver Angels, and it's also about the depolarization. But one of the aims of Braver Angels is to let people speak how they speak about what they want to speak about, without the intention of trying to change their mind, just listening to them. It's not about a debate. Now, if you want to do a formal debate, you do a debate. It's not about having an argument. It's about trying to find common ground. And so I really like that concept of, where do we agree? And so that we can make progress going forward on some topic. It might not exist, right, between me and this other person, but it could exist between other people, on a myriad of topics. So as a licensed clinical social worker, where I find this mostly coming up is that when people don't have a skill set that includes things like emotion regulation and distress tolerance and stress management and conflict mitigation, if they're not getting adequate sleep, then they're not going to have a sense of well-being that gives them the bandwidth mentally, the energy emotionally and physically to be in dialogue with people about these issues, right? To be able to dialogue with their family members, to be able to dialogue with their colleagues, with their peers, with their community members, with their communities of faith. Like because they're not going to have the wherewithal to do that. They're going to be more easily frustrated and become argumentative and go on the attack because that's all they have. That's all they have. And so when I work with people, I don't work as a psychotherapist anymore, but I do what's called psychoeducation. I teach well-being webinars in the corporate setting. And it's pretty amazing what happens, right? When I get feedback from people who said, wow, thank you so much for that information and those tools and strategies, because I'm putting them into practice and it actually is making a difference. That doesn't mean they don't still have the beliefs they have, the values they have, the principles, the convictions. It just means now they're getting along better with their child or their parent or their spouse or their coworker, their teammate. That they're working towards this dialogue. So I think that's, this. Not everybody needs to be a middle path or third space or third perspective person. But those of us who are, I think, are just natural bridge builders, because we recognize that there is a gap in between two people or two ideas or two places, and we have a particular desire and skill set and natural ability to be that bridge. But what people do as they're crossing that bridge is their own thing, but we can build
Mhm.
the bridge,
Yeah.
whatever that might look like.
Yeah, that's lovely. I think that idea of being a bridge builder and um, noticing that impulse within yourself and cultivating it is very much in line with the Black Sheep, which is why we were so excited to publish the excerpt of your book, because it's so refreshing to people who are seeking that third space. I think there is a growing desire for just acknowledgement that not everybody fits into this black or white category that we often reduce down many complex subjects to, which I know you have personally lived. I don't know if you have any particular experiences you'd like to share of living the third space yourself, that helped you to either navigate through an issue or helped you to help others by using these techniques? Because I think it's one thing to talk about it, and to like talk about, well, we use curiosity and dialogue and listening, but when you're in it, when you're faced with something that's challenging or antagonistic, it is so much harder to actually practice that. So I'd love
Yes.
some of your experience in that regard.
Yeah, well, one of the keys to that is that you start practicing it outside of those moments. Really, that's the key. I think that's why meditation and mindfulness is so popular, because it teaches you how to calm yourself in the moments when you don't need to calm yourself necessarily. So then you can tap into that. You know it's possible. Oh, yeah, I can just breathe. I can do a grounding exercise in my head. Nobody will even know what I'm doing. And that will center me or ground me. And then I'm available for this interaction that I'm about to have, because we can't avoid distressing situations and circumstances and people in our lives 100%. We need to learn how to just go through it. I mean, I talk about a few of the experiences in my book where, well, I should backtrack and say, my father exposed me not only to Buddhism, but also to a lot of these skills early on. But they were integrated into me so fully, I didn't even realize that I had a skill set that I could pull on and utilize, because I went through some pretty difficult situations in my younger years, more medical complications that resulted in paralysis and coma, and that was pretty much a struggle. And so I had to, by the time I was 8 years old, I had to re-enter society again. I had to figure out how to I learned how to walk again, talk again, read again. Everything I had to learn over again. And so that meant that I was dealing with bullying, a lot of bullying when I was a kid, because of how I looked and how I talked and how I walked. It was different from the other kids. And so kids are really good at pointing out differences in other people, and not in a flattering way, usually. And so at a pretty young age, I was exposed to that. But by the time I hit, gosh, maybe 11 years old, now I'm noticing all these other kids being bullied. I talk about it as, the Robin Hood bully thing, where I would go over to these bullies and say, hey, what are you doing? I hear you're bullying so and so. Why don't you pick on somebody like me? I wouldn't punch them. I wasn't a bully back, but I was, in a sense, like uh, I was bigger than them. I would come across as more forceful than them, and they would stop bullying these other kids. Like, why did I do that? I mean, a lot of people get bullied and just let bullying go on or become
Mm-hmm.
bullies. Why did I all of a sudden become the kind of kid that was concerned about other kids getting bullied? And because something about me, I tapped into, that felt awful. But part of what I also paid attention to was the kid that was doing the bullying. I didn't dismiss them as I didn't dehumanize them, right? I didn't dismiss them as unworthy of my attention also. There was something about them. Like, why are they bullying? What's going on in their world? Of course, I was too young to really think it all the way through. I can do that much better now. But as a kid, I was concerned also, like, why are they behaving this way? And
Right.
then typically you'd see them interacting maybe with a parent or an older sibling, and you'd be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay. Like, they've got a
Right.
mean mom or a mean dad or a mean older brother or a mean older sister, something like that.
That curiosity that you were able to show, it's kind of like burgeoning sense of there's something else at play here. That's what I want to highlight as just like this amazing skill. And I think about it more and more because I do think that the landscape we're in today, particularly the media landscape, leads us to do that less and less, where we're inclined to not slow down, like you described, is helpful for being able to practice these kind of grounding techniques that allow us to respond from a more thoughtful, expansive place, as opposed to just kind of react and become
Mm,
sucked into this back and forth
yeah.
dynamic that way. So not only are we consuming media that's like always urgent and it's fast and it's constantly refreshing, which leads us to then respond with equal speed, we're also consuming media that's increasingly simplistic and flattened. I think about it so many times because I have some friends that they're TikTok famous, and every now and then one of their videos on TikTok will end up on a different side of Twitter/X, and people will take that one video and say, oh, I can tell that she's like this. I can tell she probably does this. Oh, this is what she represents in our society. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I know her. And I know that none of that's true. And I can see, because I already know this person and know the complexity behind her and like have humanized her because I literally am her friend, I can see how not knowing her, not humanizing her allows for people to create these kind of like wild narratives that are uncharitable and just really don't actually correspond to reality. But that's the nature of these kind of simplistic mediums by which we take a 10-second video and run with a story about it and then make that part of our worldview. And so what you're describing is, even at a young age, this ability to kind of like almost slow down just enough and just to think a little more deeply. And what it makes me think of is like, it seems like you have almost never had a very intense attachment to your ego or to some kind of persona that you needed to prove and confirm, because that's what I often see is driving this rush to react, this rush to judge and then spin a narrative about something before we even say, well, could there be some other things going on here that I'm missing because it's a 10-second video? So what do you think about that idea that what we're coming up against when we try to look at the world more expansively and respond to it more thoughtfully, as opposed to getting caught in these like reactive patterns that just perpetuate often the same cycles that we're trying to break? What do you think about it being this kind of egoic possession or attachment to self concept, like who I think I am and thus who I want to prove I am? And so we're like looking out desperately
Yeah.
for anything that we can use to do that. I'd love for you to speak to that, because that's what I've been seeing.
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned just briefly a moment ago about having a strong internal locus of control. So when you have a strong internal locus of control, there's not as much sway from the external world. So I don't care much about what people think about me. But when you have or what they expect of me, right? But when you have an external locus of control, your sense of self, your value, your worth, you're gauging it based on what other people are doing or saying about you, around you, about the things you enjoy or don't enjoy, your culture, whatever it is. You're internalizing those messages, right? Those negative messages, or they could be even positive messages. But instead of having a strong sense of self that's coming from internal, the sense of self is crafted from external messaging. And that's why I remember I remember probably in my 20s when there were a lot of messages, in the 80s, there were a lot of messages towards girls in particular that, the media was distorting our sense of self, that there were these images of women that were unachievable and that it was destroying our sense of self. And I remember I would hear those kinds of messages, and I would read them, and I would say, like, who are they talking about? Like, I never compared myself to, Christy Brinkley on the freeway, off ramp, big billboard, or the magazines that had, that were portraying women, in certain ways. Like, I didn't do that, and I don't do that. But people who do compare themselves to other people are the people then that are going to say, oh, I'm not living up to that expectation, or I'm not as good as they are, or they're going to be envious and they're going to try and destroy what that other person has, right? And so part of having a strong internal locus of control is that, and it's gotten stronger and stronger as I've gotten older. It's not as if like it's just sealed up when you're young and it stays that way. It's gotten stronger as I've gotten older. I'm not swayed by those things. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's a simple concept, but it's a very challenging process to go through, right? To learn how to cultivate an internal locus of control, to not be so inclined to worry about what other people say. I think a modern example of this would be, oh gosh, what is it referred to? Oh gosh, sorry. It's like when people start a new job and the imposter syndrome, right? Imposter syndrome is all external. Comparing yourself to, am I as good as my coworkers? Do I know as much as I think I know? Am I going to be good? Are they going to value me? Are they going to appreciate me? Rather than a sense of, well, this is me. My take is, well, it's a new job. I don't know everything I need to know yet. I'm going to learn it. And that's why I have a 90-day, probation period. And then I'm going to work, on the things that I still need to work on. And by the end of the year, I'll be fine. I'll be good to go. I'll be able to train other people. Like, I don't know. I don't get this concept of imposter syndrome, right? So I think that's because I'm so internally driven. So I would say to people, that once you learn how to, again, it's the well-being stuff. Once you learn how to get a control of your emotions and your distress tolerance and how you deal with conflict and making sure you're getting good night's sleep and you're hydrated and well nourished, all these things, it gives you that energy to focus a bit more on like, okay, what else isn't working? What else can I do to make a difference for me in my life? It's, everybody knows that message when you're on the plane and they say put on your mask before somebody else's, right? Like, this is just another example of that. Like, take care of yourself, and then you'll be a better person, you'll do better, and then you can go out into the world, and then help other people to be better.
Zander, I want to tell you about that internal locus versus external locus of control element, something I think you might be interested in. So you and I worked together at the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism some time ago. And while there, you ran the organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings for organizations. And the point of that program was to offer DEI in a way that was about genuine diversity, inclusion, equality, and not this, a lot of the just horrible ideas that are being put into institutions under the name DEI. So I have a book that we're going to be releasing through the Black Sheep in a month or so about the origins of a lot of what has become DEI training in that bad methodology. And in one of the absolute earliest experiments where they were running that, a teacher training in a school on so-called anti-racism. It was in practice an extremely racist program. But on the sheet where they were evaluating the success or lack of success, they asked the teachers who were trained to fill out what their response to the program was, and they asked, do you feel that you personally have agency, or that it's in societal structures, it's external, right? And they marked as a successful outcome of the program if they moved people to a more external locus of control. because then they would be about changing the systems
Yeah.
and the systems
Yeah.
rather than being able to do anything as individuals.
Gosh, that's bleak.
Yeah.
Which
Well,
on that note
yeah.
makes me want to ask you, like, as somebody that's worked in social work, how have you seen that divide in the field? And, you know, I read Abigail Schreier's book not long ago, Bad Therapy, but, you know, about these therapists and these therapy styles that seem to be causing more harm than they are good.
Well, yeah. That's just crazy. I'm looking forward to reading your book to learn more about what was going on. Jeez Louise. Well, you know, one example is social emotional learning. So, you know, I said emotion regulation, distress tolerance, conflict mitigation. These are components of social emotional learning, right? Emotional intelligence. And with teaching social emotional learning in the schools, the original social emotional learning curriculum was all focused on developing an internal locus of control. Because if you can regulate your emotions and tolerate distress and manage your stress and mitigate conflict and have effective communication, you're going to be more, you know, controlled from yourself, not all the things around you. Because again, conflict is inevitable. It's never going to go away. But in the summer of 2020, they changed the SEL curriculum to transformative social emotional learning and switched the emphasis to responding to microaggressions and calling people out for their microaggressions and their racism. And so it also did that split. So a lot of this is in the schools through the anti-bullying programming. And it's run by teachers who are not trained clinicians to do, you know, a lot of people say that this work should be done by clinicians, like maybe the school social workers, not the school teachers. That's one example. Another example, more specifically, that's with psychotherapy, is, you know, standard psychotherapy is a process of exploration and unfolding and, you know, learning about the self. And so the therapist is there to assist with that by maybe asking probing questions, asking for clarification on things, you know, to expound on, you know, what a person is saying. And one of the things, and this is probably in Abigail's book, I haven't read that one yet, is that within, let's say specifically within, you know, with young people who have gender dysphoria, or they have some sort of gender distress, or they're just gender non-conforming, and people are kind of steering them more towards a trans identity than the possibility of the just going to grow up to be gay or lesbian, or just a gender non-conforming, you know, person that's heterosexual. That this idea of when those children come into therapy, that to do a traditional psychotherapeutic, you know, process with them to explore their ideas about gender. Where are they hearing this? What are they learning? Who's telling them that? What programs are they watching and listening to? And, you know, how are they feeling about themselves? This is considered conversion therapy by some. Like, people are writing professional papers that are getting published in journals, like academic journals, peer-reviewed journals, that are saying that wanting to just explore all of the various ways that a child is thinking and feeling and believing and experiencing is akin to conversion therapy. As a person who went through conversion therapy for about 8 months of my life, when I was 16 years old, I can tell you that exploration is not conversion. What we do have to be careful about, though, is people who want to do a conversion therapy and call it exploratory, right? And then people who want to denigrate exploration as a natural process in therapy. Because if we don't let children, or even adolescents, or anybody, adults, if we don't let them really talk through what is going on in their world, and we just interject, then we're not therapists at that point, right? We're being maybe a coach. And we need to keep a clear line between being a coach, being an advisor, being a mentor, and being a therapist. And we also need to be able to keep, in my opinion, right, I think we need, just ethically, we need to be able to keep a very clear distinction between activism and therapy. So if a therapist happens to also be an activist out in the community, activism should not be brought into the therapy room, right? That's then imposing our values, our desires for the client or the patient on them, and that's really not what we're supposed to do, right? The in social work, at least, our one of our foundations of how we work with patients or clients is meet the client where they are, right? It's not our job to tell them that they're doing something wrong. Our hope is that if they're doing things that are harmful to them, like abusing drugs or people or themselves, that we can help them explore that so they can come to their own conclusions that yes, this is a problem. I'm hurting myself. But we don't
Right.
just tell them, you're hurting yourself, unless
Yeah.
they're
Do
truly
something
right,
different.
unless it's suicidal kinds of things, and then
Mm-hmm.
we report them. Right, so we have a duty to report at that point. So
Right.
it's I think that's one of the ways that I would imagine that that's one of the things Abigail is talking about is this inability for therapists who now feel that they will be, brought up on charges by their licensing board if they do exploratory therapy because somebody will turn
Mm.
them in for doing conversion therapy. And then they have to spend all kinds of time and energy to fight against that, and it could also mean a lot of money doing that. And I know some therapists who have been through that process, and it is not fun. um, it can be really debilitating on them, just emotionally and mentally, to go through that process. So I mean, that's
Yeah,
an unfortunate thing that's been happening more recently.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you spoke to that because I know there's a lot of us that have the sense that that's what we're seeing, and it's great to hear from someone on the inside that
Yeah,
you've seen this as well, and hopefully we can start shifting directions before more harm is done.
yeah,
And what really stands out to me about this is that throughout the discussion we've had about the third space and this idea of bringing a more expansive, curious, open outlook to conflict in the world and in our lives, you see the same problem in therapy. It's this same turn away from that process and a turn towards its opposite in some ways, which is we're going to focus on trying to control outcomes. We're
mm,
going to try to
yeah,
force our view on things. And it's this very much this demonization of that same exploration we're talking about that allows for being able to see the full picture
yeah.
and thus respond more accurately to what's in front of us when we have that information, as opposed to rushing to judge and force our view on things without even actually fully accounting for what the thing is.
Well, this is
So,
where the third space concept can kind of come into
mhm,
play here, because well, why would they be doing that? Like, why are the
mhm,
teachers teaching things that are off curriculum? Why are therapists doing what they're doing, in affirming, their clients, and then just passing them on to medical providers who are going to give them, medications, for their distress? Why would they be doing that? Well, partly why they might be doing that is they've gotten the message that they're supposed to do it. But why? And I think that there's some history. If you look back, I'm almost 60 years old, so I lived through the period of where I lost a lot of my gay male friends to AIDS, in the early and mid 80s. And I also was present when they were disowned by their family members as they were dying, that their long-term partners were denied coming in and visiting them in their rooms, that gay and lesbian teenagers were being kicked out of their homes by their parents, that they were being sent off to these, tough love camps and ex-gay ministry programs. And so I think that history, that memory, has survived, and it has been passed through the
mm,
generations, to say, it's another version of never again, right? There's other,
mhm,
other historical events where never again is the messaging. This is another one. It's like never again is a LGBT kid going to be kicked out on the streets. Never again is a are they going to be denied? Are we going to be denied access? So I think that it's I think initially for some it came from a good place, a place of compassion. For some, I just think they're just very radical and they're more postmodernists and they want to destroy and deconstruct and destabilize, as much as possible because that's the aim, that's the goal, And so some, I think most people are well intentioned and they're getting the message that this is what they're supposed to be about and for and what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to just affirm and pass on and or champion even an informed consent process where there's no seeing any sort of social worker or mental health provider at all. And I think eventually we're going to learn that was not a good. This was not good, right? We're in the middle of it now, and we can't really see it so much. But so it's like I understand, that could be one of the reasons behind getting fully on board with young people not having to go through this experience of because Pete, you'll hear teachers or even supporters of teachers saying, well, the parents might not be supportive. Okay, right, maybe they won't, but are you actually saying something more like the parents might be abusive?
Mhm.
Because if you think the parents are prone to abuse, then you should call child welfare services, child protective services. You're a mandated reporter too as a
Right.
teacher. So it's hard to know why they, are intervening in this way with parents being brought in to their children's lives and their experiences. But this is being waged all across our country now here in the United States with laws that are popping up in different states. So it's getting played out in the political realm,
Mhm.
which, that's where these extremes are going to pop up. You're going to have some states that are like fully lenient, like everything's okay, and then other states where nothing's okay and they shut it all down. And again, those are just two extremes that I don't think are very workable,
Yeah.
especially if it comes to adults. So
Yeah.
yeah, but we're kind of heading
Yeah,
in that
that's
direction right now. It's getting that's a piece of the polarization that's happening.
absolutely.
But I
And yet
think there
another
was good
great example of
intentions.
the third space being
Yeah,
necessary.
yeah. So if people could come together, this is I think part of the issue is it's really difficult to bring people together who have different or even opposing views to sit down together and actually have a conversation. And it's like how to disagree better. We're not always going to find common ground, but can we disagree better? And then is it possible in our disagreeing better that we're able to develop a connection that might actually continue on and we can learn more and more from each other and then have a better understanding of, what do you think? It's not what they think, right? It's just going person by person by person and not
Yes.
not grouping people into an identity group,
Yeah,
which
and
is what
and we are
DEI
reaping the
was
fruits of what
doing,
that
right?
is. Yeah, exactly. And we're seeing the division and the polarization and the talking over each other that kind of approach creates. So as we wrap up here, I'd love if you could leave our listeners with three tips for disagreeing better in your life or for facing
Mm,
conflict in a more productive way. What would you say are
yeah.
the top three tips someone could use for that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is to, hmm, two, three. Well, I want to start from the beginning because I think you have to sort of set it up, you have to sort of prepare yourself. So the first thing would be that you have to come from a place where you can, take a hold of yourself, where you can, so figure out, learn the skills of emotional intelligence, and then practice them in these non, you know, in these environments where, it's not being stressed, right? You're not stressed. And then I think another thing is too, that when I used to do public speaking, one of the things that I used to do, and there was a lot of kind of arguments around, that would be coming at me as I was doing this, is I would try to find something that the other person was saying that I could agree with. It's just one thing. Like, was it their emotion they were expressing? Was it a particular sentiment? Was there something in it? An example would be, from back in the day would be somebody saying, a parent saying, "Oh, I wouldn't want my kid to go to school with a gay teacher," and I would be like, "Okay, take a breath," and I would say, "Well, I'm not a parent, but if I was, I would imagine there'd be so many things that I would be worried about my kid being, hurt." And then I would follow it up with an educational piece, Well, it turns out that the majority of people that are abusing kids are not gay teachers, So I'd say find something that you can agree with. That the person is communicating, because if we're able to do that, that can lower the defensiveness, of the person, because they're looking for a fight, or they're expecting a fight. So you don't give them the fight. You just acknowledge what they said, provide a response, and then move on. And then what I used to do also is, and I think this is helpful for people, is you can always follow up with people. Follow up with, if you're on a panel with people, if you're in a room with other people, if there's people that are in the space where you are, where this conversation is happening, later on you can always ask them, like, "Hey, do you have any feedback for me? Was there something that I did or said that you think I could have done it differently to get my message across better, or in a way that would have been more well received?" Right? Because the people that are standing on the observing side are the ones that get to see what's happening. When we're in it, and it's hard for us to pull ourselves out of it, even if we have a lot of good training. If it's a particular topic that really gets us going, right? And we all tend to have one or two of those that it's hard to pull ourselves out of. So it's good to get the feedback from other people, but we have to take care of ourselves, and we have to, work with people in a way that is humanizing to them, which is why I think finding something to agree with can put them at ease.
Zander, thank you for that. The world would be a better place if people listened to that advice, so I hope they will. We at the Black Sheep, we work to help people recognize a lot of those same and similar truths. So here's to it. I hope you find perhaps some better luck than we have. I really hope people read your book, The Third Space. Do you want to tell people where they can get it, where they can follow you online? Anything else you want to let them know?
Sure. Well, I'm not on social media, so I have a webpage, zanderkeig.net. That Keig is Keig. It's available on Amazon for individuals, and for people who want to buy, more than one copy. I think you can get it through bulk order through Ingram Spark. But it's also on my website, so zanderkeig.net, and you can find that book and all the other books that I've worked on over the years at that website. So, but thank you, and also I wanted to say thank you for the kind words about the book and how it was in a perfect timing for you. That's like the best thing to hear from a reader, is that it was something that was just happened to be there when you needed it. So I want to just say thank you to that, Solomon.
Oh, absolutely. And I really recommend people check it out. I found that it was a calming read. It's like you tune out of the discord and the chaos and the aggression and the constant fighting in our culture now. And your book really does create this like third place for you to go to, where it feels like a little bit of a respite, where it reconnected me to the values that I care about. And it's like, yes, this is what we should be working for. So thank you so much for writing it, for publishing it, for sharing it with our readers. And like this video, help us to get these conversations out more, to get them more popular than the constant bickering back and forth. This is the way forward. And thank you so much, Zander, for helping us to pave the path forward.
You're welcome. Thank you.